The relationship between Ibrahim and Aida had evolved into a partnership that encompassed both personal intimacy and serious discussions about Burkina Faso's future. Their conversations increasingly touched on the central question that defined Ibrahim's presidency, the promised transition to civilian rule that had been repeatedly delayed due to security concerns. They were walking through Benguir Huogo Urban Park one evening, Ibrahim's security detail maintaining a discreet distance while monitoring the perimeter, when Aida raised the subject that had been occupying both their thoughts. The international community is increasing pressure for concrete steps toward elections, she observed, her voice careful but direct, and domestic voices are beginning to question whether the delays are truly about security or about maintaining power. Ibrahim didn't respond immediately, his hands clasped behind his back as they walked along the park's winding paths. The official position of his government was clear and had been consistently communicated. Elections would be held when security conditions permitted proper democratic processes throughout the country. But Aida's question touched on doubts that had been growing in his own mind, doubts that he couldn't express to his advisors or cabinet members without undermining their confidence in his leadership. "I've been thinking about that question myself," he admitted finally. "When I took power, it was with the genuine intention of stabilizing the country and then transferring authority to civilian leadership. But the reality of governance has been more complex than I anticipated." "How so?" Aida asked, genuinely curious about his internal struggle. Ibrahim paused beside a small pond where families were feeding ducks, children laughing as the birds competed for pieces of bread. This scene represented the peaceful Burkina Faso he was trying to create, but it existed alongside the harsh realities of ongoing insurgency and regional instability. Every time we set a timeline for transition, new crises emerge: insurgent attacks, coup attempts by military hardliners, pressure from international partners with conflicting agendas. It becomes easy to justify delays, to argue that stability must come before democracy. "And you don't believe that anymore?" Aida pressed gently. "I'm not sure I ever fully believed it," he replied with surprising honesty, "but I convinced myself it was necessary. Now I wonder if the delays are creating their own instability, if the uncertainty about political transition is contributing to the problems we're trying to solve." They continued walking, passing joggers and families enjoying the evening air. The normalcy of the park contrasted sharply with the complexity of the political decisions weighing on Ibrahim's mind. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, genuinely seeking her perspective. Not as a political advisor or a government official, but as someone who has lived through the consequences of both failed governance and military intervention. Aida considered the question carefully, understanding the weight of what he was asking. "I think you already know," she replied gently. "The Ibrahim I knew as a student believed deeply in people's right to determine their own future. He studied geology because he wanted to understand our country's resources so they could be developed for everyone's benefit, not controlled by a few." "I still believe that," Ibrahim insisted, but his voice carried uncertainty. "But I've also seen how that right can be manipulated by foreign interests, by extremist groups, by politicians who promise everything and deliver nothing. The democratic processes that work in stable countries might not be adequate for our current challenges." "So you don't trust the Burkinabe people to make the right choice?" she asked, the question striking at something fundamental in his worldview. Ibrahim stopped walking entirely, turning to face her with an expression of genuine inner conflict. "I trust them," he said slowly, "but I fear the circumstances might not allow for truly free choice. Not yet. When insurgents can attack polling stations, when foreign powers can fund favored candidates, when poverty makes people vulnerable to vote buying, is that really democracy?" Those are all real challenges, Aida acknowledged, but they're also the kinds of challenges that every democracy has faced. The question is whether postponing elections indefinitely solves those problems or creates new ones. Before Ibrahim could respond, his secure phone buzzed with an urgent priority message. His expression immediately shifted as he read the encrypted text, his jaw tightening with concern. "What is it?" Aida asked, recognizing the change in his demeanor. "Intelligence reports indicate a possible coup attempt," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that emerged during crisis situations. "Hardline military elements opposed to any transition to civilian rule. I need to return to the palace immediately." The irony was not lost on either of them. Their discussion about democratic transition had been interrupted by a threat from those who opposed any transfer of power from military to civilian. Within minutes, Ibrahim's security detail had surrounded them and was coordinating rapid transport back to the presidential palace. As they traveled through Ouagadougou's evening traffic, Ibrahim's phone buzzed constantly with updates from various security agencies. "The intelligence is still being verified," Colonel Sawadogo reported from the front seat, but multiple sources indicate coordinated meetings between certain military commanders and civilian political figures aligned with the previous government. Ibrahim processed this information while considering response options. A coup attempt against his government would represent not just a personal threat, but a fundamental challenge to the stability he had worked to establish. His response would need to be decisive enough to neutralize the threat while avoiding actions that could destabilize the broader political environment. "Suspected timeline?" he asked. "Possibly within 48 hours, Colonel Sawadogo replied from the front seat. "The plan appears to involve simultaneous moves against key government installations and communication centers, followed by declarations from the participating commanders that they're acting to prevent the country from falling into chaos." The following hours tested everything Ibrahim had built during his presidency. The coup attempt, while ultimately unsuccessful, revealed significant divisions within the military establishment that he had underestimated. Some commanders who had supported his initial rise to power now opposed any transition that would reduce military influence over national governance. Ibrahim's response demonstrated the decisive leadership that had brought him to power. He personally addressed military units whose loyalty remained uncertain, consolidated control over key installations, and authorized the arrest of officers directly involved in the conspiracy. By the following evening, the immediate threat had been neutralized, but the underlying tensions remained. 3 days later, with the situation stabilized, Ibrahim finally contacted Aida to continue their interrupted conversation. "I've been thinking about what you said in the park," he began without preamble when she answered her phone, "about the people's right to determine their future." "And?" she asked gently, understanding that the recent crisis had likely influenced his thinking. "The coup attempt came from people who believe military rule should be permanent," Ibrahim said. "They see civilian governance as weakness, democracy as chaos waiting to happen. Their actions reminded me that delaying transition doesn't eliminate political instability, it just changes its form." Aida remained silent, allowing him to work through his thoughts. "I've decided to announce a definitive timeline for elections, 8 months from now, with a constitutional convention beginning immediately. It's enough time to establish proper security measures and electoral frameworks, but not so long that it appears to be another delay tactic." "That's a significant decision," Aida observed. "How are your advisors responding?" "Mixed reactions," Ibrahim admitted. Some support it as necessary for long-term stability. Others argue that the security situation remains too fragile. But the coup attempt convinced me that indefinite military rule creates its own instabilities. And what about your personal role in the new system? Aida asked, addressing the question that affected both his public responsibilities and their private relationship. Ibrahim was quiet for a long moment. "I've been considering that carefully," he said finally. "Some expect me to find a way to maintain control, perhaps as a powerful defense minister or through constitutional provisions for military oversight." "And what do you want?" she pressed. "I want Burkina Faso to be secure and prosperous," Ibrahim replied after a thoughtful pause. "But I'm no longer convinced that requires me to remain in power indefinitely. Perhaps the best service I can provide is to demonstrate that military intervention can be truly temporary, that power can be transferred voluntarily when its purpose has been achieved." The decision to announce a concrete transition timeline marked a turning point not just in Ibrahim's presidency, but in his personal understanding of leadership and legacy. Over the following weeks, as constitutional drafting committees began their work and electoral preparations commenced, he found himself focusing increasingly on what would come after his presidency, both for the country and for his relationship with Aida. "Have you thought about what we'll do?" Aida asked one evening as they reviewed draft constitutional articles in her apartment. "After the transition, I mean. What our life might look like when you're no longer president." Ibrahim looked up from the documents spread across her small dining table. "I've thought about it constantly," he admitted. "For the first time since taking office, I'm allowing myself to imagine a future that isn't defined by crisis management and state responsibilities." "And what do you imagine?" she asked, moving to sit beside him. "Something quieter," he said, reaching for her hand. "Maybe a house outside Ouagadougou, close enough to remain engaged when needed, but far enough to have privacy. Time to write about these experiences, perhaps to teach at the university again, and time to build something with you that isn't complicated by security protocols and political calculations." Aida smiled at the vision he was painting. "It sounds peaceful." "It sounds like a life worth working toward," Ibrahim replied. "But first, we need to ensure the transition succeeds, that Burkina Faso moves forward with stability and hope, rather than falling back into the cycles of instability that brought me to power." The morning sun cast long shadows across the red earth of Burkina Faso as President Ibrahim Traoré prepared for another day carrying the hopes and fears of 23 million people. At 37, he had become the world's youngest head of state through circumstances he never could have predicted during his university days studying geology. The mineral-rich soil of his homeland, once the subject of his academic passion, now represented strategic assets in a complex geopolitical chess game that extended far beyond West Africa's borders. Ibrahim stood at the window of his presidential office, watching the bustling streets of Ouagadougou come alive. Street vendors arranged their wares, children in colorful uniforms walked to school, and the city's famous red dust began to swirl in the morning breeze. Each scene represented lives that depended, in some measure, on the decisions he would make that day. The presidential motorcade moved through Ouagadougou's streets with practiced efficiency, armored vehicles maintaining precise formation, while motorcycle escorts cleared the path ahead. Inside the lead vehicle, Ibrahim reviewed briefing documents for his upcoming hospital visit, one of many public engagements designed to demonstrate his administration's commitment to improving healthcare infrastructure. "Mr. President, will arrive at the Central Hospital in approximately 8 minutes," announced Colonel Sawadago, his chief of security, from the front passenger seat. "The medical staff has been briefed on security protocols, and the media area has been established according to your specifications." Ibrahim nodded without looking up from his papers, accustomed to the constant choreography that surrounded his public appearances. Every movement was calculated, every interaction planned, every moment accounted for by staff members whose primary concern was maintaining the careful balance between accessibility and security that defined modern African leadership. The convoy slowed as it approached a section of Boulevard Charles de Gaulle, where crowds had gathered behind security barriers. This was not unusual. Burkinabe citizens often gathered to catch glimpses of their president, especially the younger generation, who saw in Ibrahim echoes of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who had briefly transformed their nation decades earlier. "Standard crowd size, Mr. President," Colonel Sawadago reported, his trained eyes scanning the assembled people. "Mostly families, some students, no immediate security concerns identified." Ibrahim finally looked up from his documents, his gaze moving across the faces pressed against the barriers. These moments always affected him profoundly. The reminder that behind every policy decision, every military operation, every diplomatic negotiation were real people whose lives would be impacted by his choices. Among the sea of faces, something caught his attention. A woman standing slightly apart from the main crowd, her posture familiar in a way that sent an unexpected jolt through his memory. Time seemed to suspend itself as their eyes met across the distance, and Ibrahim felt his carefully controlled world shift on its axis. "Stop the vehicle," he commanded suddenly, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately alerted his security detail. "Sir, we cannot stop here without proper advanced security measures," Colonel Sawadago responded, his training automatically asserting protocol over presidential preference. "I said stop," Ibrahim repeated, his tone leaving no room for discussion while his eyes remained fixed on the woman who had triggered this moment of recognition. The convoy came to an abrupt halt, immediately triggering radio communications between security units as protocols designed for unexpected stops activated. Within seconds, Ibrahim had opened his door and stepped onto the street, his movements generating excited murmurs from the crowd, who suddenly found their president among them rather than safely contained within his armored vehicle. "Ida," he whispered, the name escaping his lips as memory flooded back with overwhelming force. The woman's hand rose to her mouth in surprise, her own recognition evident in the way her eyes widened. It was indeed Ida Ouedraogo, the woman he had loved during his university years, the woman he had believed dead for the past 5 years, following reports of her disappearance during insurgent attacks in northern Burkina Faso. Standing there in the dusty street, surrounded by his security detail and hundreds of curious onlookers, Ibrahim Traoré felt more vulnerable than he had since assuming the presidency. The careful emotional control that had served him through military campaigns and political crises suddenly seemed inadequate for this moment of personal revelation. University of Ouagadougou, 2008. The library had been their sanctuary, a quiet refuge from the bustling energy of university life where they could study together and debate the future of their country. Ibrahim remembered the afternoon they first met with crystal clarity, Ida arguing passionately with the librarian about access to restricted geological journals, while he, a shy geology student, had gathered the courage to intervene on her behalf. Those materials are essential for understanding our country's mineral resources, Ida had insisted, her determination evident in every word. Ibrahim had approached quietly, offering his student identification and explaining the academic necessity of the materials. His intervention had succeeded in securing the journals, but more importantly, it had earned him Ida's grateful smile and the beginning of a conversation that would span months and eventually grow into love. Their relationship had blossomed amid the optimism of university life, fueled by shared dreams of contributing to Burkina Faso's development. Ibrahim's passion for geology was matched by Ida's dedication to environmental science, and together they had envisioned a future where they could help their country develop its natural resources sustainably and equitably. Those dreams had been interrupted by the growing security crisis that began affecting Burkina Faso in 2009. As insurgent groups gained strength and government responses proved inadequate, Ibrahim had made the difficult decision to abandon his geological studies and join the military, believing that direct action was necessary to protect the country and its people. The decision had cost him his relationship with Ida, who had chosen to complete her studies and pursue teaching in rural communities. Their paths had diverged completely when Ibrahim entered military service, beginning the journey that would eventually lead him to the presidency through the coup that removed his predecessor in 2022. Presidential Palace, present day. Within 30 minutes of their unexpected reunion, Ida found herself seated in a secure government meeting room across from the man who had once been her closest companion and was now one of Africa's most closely watched leaders. The transformation was striking. The gentle-eyed geology student had become a hardened military commander whose every movement spoke of discipline and carefully controlled power. Ibrahim had removed his signature dark sunglasses, revealing eyes that held depths of experience she could never have imagined during their university days. The room itself spoke of power and isolation. Mahogany furniture, formal portraits of previous leaders, and the subtle presence of security technology that monitored every conversation within these walls. "They told me you were dead," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of grief that official reports had never conveyed. "The officials told me you were dead. They told me you were dead. After the attacks on the northern villages in 2019, your name was on the missing and presumed dead list. I attended a memorial service. Your former professor from the university organized it." The revelation struck Ida unexpectedly. Professor Ouedraogo organized a memorial? "He spoke about your passion for environmental science, your dream of helping rural communities develop sustainable practices. There were perhaps 50 people there, classmates, faculty, some of the farmers you had worked with during your research projects. I sat in the back, not wanting to intrude on public grief with my own private loss." Ida felt tears beginning to form as she imagined this gathering of people who had cared about her, mourning her supposed death when she was enduring captivity in camps across the border. "I never knew," she whispered. Ibrahim nodded slowly, his own memories of that period still painful despite the years that had passed. "I was missing for almost 2 years," she confirmed after regaining her composure. "I was taken during the dawn raid on our village. Most of the women and children were transported to camps across the border in Mali. The conditions were—" She paused, searching for words that could convey the horror without reliving it entirely. "We lived in constant fear. Food was scarce. Medical care was non-existent. Some of the women and children didn't survive." Ibrahim's jaw tightened as he processed this information. The insurgent practice of kidnapping civilians for forced labor, sexual slavery, and psychological warfare was well documented in his intelligence briefings, but hearing it described by someone he had once loved made the abstract horror viscerally real. The worst part wasn't the physical hardship, Ida continued, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. It was the psychological warfare. They would tell us that no one was looking for us, that our families had forgotten us, that the government didn't care about people from remote villages. When you're isolated and vulnerable, those lies begin to feel like truth. "How did you survive mentally?" Ibrahim asked, genuinely curious about the resilience that had clearly carried her through such an ordeal. "Some of the other women," Ida replied. "There was a teacher among us, an older woman named Fatima, who had been taken from a school near the border. She began teaching the children in secret, using sticks to write in the sand, telling stories to preserve their sense of wonder despite everything around us. Watching her maintain hope and purpose, even in captivity, taught me something profound about the power of education to preserve humanity in the darkest circumstances." Ibrahim found himself leaning forward, deeply moved by this account of courage and dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. "How did you escape?" he asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "I didn't escape," Ida replied simply. "I was rescued during a military operation in 2023. Your operation, actually. The raid on the insurgent camp near the Mali border. I was among the 37 civilians freed during that mission." The irony was almost unbearable. Ibrahim closed his eyes briefly, remembering the operation clearly. It had been one of his first major military decisions as president, launched based on intelligence indicating the presence of high-value insurgent targets. The successful rescue of civilians had been reported as a positive outcome, but he had never reviewed the list of those freed, focusing instead on the strategic implications of the mission. "I remember that operation," he said quietly. "Operation Liberation Dawn. We had intelligence that a major insurgent commander was meeting with foreign allies at that location. The rescue of civilians was a secondary objective." "I know," Ida said, without judgment. "The soldiers who freed us were professional and kind, but it was clear that saving us wasn't their primary mission. We were what military people call collateral benefit, I think." The phrase struck Ibrahim with uncomfortable precision. Throughout his presidency, he had made decisions based on strategic necessities, often without full consideration of their human dimensions. Here was a reminder that behind every military operation were individual lives whose stories he had never taken time to understand. "And after your rescue?" he asked, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. "Months of recovery, physical healing, but also psychological. The experience changes you in ways that are difficult to explain to those who haven't lived through it. The government provided some counseling services, basic medical care, and a small resettlement allowance. When I was finally ready to rebuild my life, I discovered that both my parents had died while I was in captivity. My father from illness that could have been treated if medical care had been available in their rural clinic. My mother from what neighbors described as heartbreak. She never stopped believing I would return, never stopped waiting." "I'm sorry," Ibrahim said, the words feeling inadequate for such profound loss. "Many of us have lost much," Ida replied with quiet dignity. "It's the reality of our country these past years. But I've found purpose in teaching children who have experienced similar trauma. Many of my students are orphans or have been displaced by violence. Helping them learn and heal has become my way of contributing to recovery." She paused, studying his face carefully. "What about you, Ibrahim? What has power cost you, personally? The question was more direct than any he typically faced in official meetings, and more honest than anything his advisors would dare ask. Ibrahim considered his response carefully, aware that his answer would reveal something fundamental about how leadership had changed him. "Everything and nothing," he said finally. "I've gained the ability to make decisions that affect millions of lives, to direct resources toward problems that matter, to represent our country on the world stage. But I've lost," he searched for the right words, "the luxury of private emotion, of personal relationships that exist separate from political calculation. Every friendship, every interaction, every moment of apparent relaxation is subject to security protocols and political analysis." "That sounds lonely," Ida observed. "Profoundly lonely," Ibrahim acknowledged. "There are perhaps 5 people in this country who see me as Ibrahim rather than as President Traoré, and even they must balance personal feelings against professional responsibilities. Is that why you stopped the motorcade when you saw me? Because I represent something from before all of this?" Ibrahim found himself studying this woman who had endured so much yet maintained the essential warmth and strength he remembered from their university days. Her ordeal had clearly left its mark. There were lines of experience around her eyes, a carefulness in her movements that spoke of someone who had learned to be vigilant. But the core of who she was, the compassion and intelligence that had first attracted him, remained intact. "Partly," he said honestly, "but also because seeing you alive felt like a miracle. In a role where I'm constantly confronted with problems that seem impossible to solve, with violence that seems impossible to end, discovering that someone I thought was lost forever had actually survived and was building something positive, it reminded me that hope is sometimes justified." Eastern District School, 2 weeks later. Ibrahim had insisted on visiting Ida's school, not as an official presidential engagement, but as a personal request to understand the work that had given her life meaning after her traumatic experiences. The small schoolhouse stood in marked contrast to the government buildings he typically frequented, its walls painted a cheerful yellow despite obvious age, decorated with children's artwork and educational posters that spoke of dedicated teachers working with limited resources. The journey to the school had taken him through parts of Ouagadougou he rarely saw from his presidential motorcade. Here, life proceeded at a different pace. Women carrying water jugs balanced perfectly on their heads, men repairing motorcycles under the shade of mango trees, children playing football with balls made from plastic bags and string. This was the Burkina Faso that existed beyond government buildings and diplomatic meetings, vibrant, resourceful, and resilient despite the challenges that dominated his daily briefings. He had minimized his security detail and worn civilian clothes, hoping to observe Aida's teaching without the disruption that official presidential visits inevitably caused. Only the school's director knew the true identity of Miss Ouedraogo's friend, who had requested permission to observe classes. "We started this garden as a practical science lesson," Aida explained, as she led him past small plots where students were growing tomatoes, okra, and other vegetables. "But it's become much more than that. Many of these children have seen violence destroy rather than create. Watching something grow because of their care teaches them a different way of interacting with the world." Ibrahim knelt beside one of the garden plots, examining the careful rows of young plants. A small placard, written in a child's handwriting, identified the plot as belonging to Aminata's class, and listed the vegetables being grown: tomatoes, onions, lettuce, and herbs for traditional medicine. "The children take turns watering and tending their sections," Aida continued. "They keep journals documenting growth patterns, noting which plants thrive and which struggle. It's become a lesson in patience, responsibility, and hope, qualities that are especially important for children who have experienced trauma. Ibrahim understood the profound psychology behind what might have appeared to be a simple school project. In a country where children had witnessed destruction and loss, the act of nurturing life represented hope and agency in the most fundamental way. "This reminds me of something," he said, standing and brushing soil from his hands. "When I was a child, my grandmother had a small garden behind our compound. She used to tell me that plants were like people. They needed the right conditions to grow, but with proper care, even the most damaged could flourish again." Aida smiled at the memory he had shared. "Your grandmother sounds wise. What happened to her garden?" "It's still there," Ibrahim replied, "though I haven't visited it must be 3 years now. The security requirements for presidential travel make spontaneous visits to family compounds complicated." "That must be difficult," Aida observed, "being separated from places and people that shaped you." "It's one of the costs of office I didn't fully anticipate," Ibrahim admitted. "The isolation extends beyond political relationships to personal ones. Even family interactions become formal occasions rather than natural connections." As they continued walking through the school grounds, Ibrahim noticed details that revealed both the dedication of the staff and the challenges they faced. Classrooms were crowded but well organized, with teachers using creative methods to maximize limited resources. In one room, students shared textbooks, taking turns reading aloud while others followed along. In another, a teacher had created multiplication tables using bottle caps and cardboard, making mathematics tangible for children who learned better through physical manipulation than abstract concepts. As they toured the school, Ibrahim observed how the children responded to Aida with a combination of affection, respect, and security that spoke to the safe environment she had helped create. These were children who had experienced trauma similar to her own, and her ability to provide them with stability and hope seemed to emerge from her own journey of recovery and renewal. "Miss Ouedraogo," called a young voice, and they turned to see a girl of about 9 running toward them with a piece of paper clutched in her small hands. "I finished my story." "That's wonderful, Fatima," Aida smiled warmly. "Would you like to share it with me and my friend?" The girl looked up at Ibrahim with curiosity, but without the intimidation that adults often showed in his presence. Her eyes were bright with the excitement of creative accomplishment, untainted by the political awareness that might have made her cautious around authority figures. "It's about a brave girl who saves her village from bad men," she explained proudly, holding up her drawing that accompanied the story. The illustration showed a small figure facing much larger, threatening shapes, but the girl in the drawing stood up upright and confident, her arms outstretched, as if protecting others behind her. "That sounds like a story I would very much like to hear," Ibrahim said, crouching down to the child's level. "Would you read it to us?" Fatima nodded enthusiastically and began to read from her careful handwriting. "Once there was a girl named Amina who lived in a happy village with her family. One day, bad men came with big trucks and wanted to hurt everyone. But Amina was very clever. She remembered the stories her grandmother told her about using wisdom instead of fighting. So she tricked the bad men by telling them there was gold in the next village. When they left to look for gold, Amina ran to warn the other village, and they called the soldiers to catch the bad men. Everyone was safe because Amina was brave and smart." Fatima's story, told in the confident voice of a child who had found her agency through education, spoke of a clever girl who outwitted dangerous men threatening her community. As Ibrahim listened, he was struck by how the child's imaginative narrative reflected the harsh realities that many Burkina had faced, but transformed them into a tale of empowerment rather than victimization. The story also revealed something profound about how children process trauma and fear, not through passive victimhood, but by imagining themselves as agents of protection and change. In Fatima's narrative, the young protagonist didn't defeat evil through violence, but through intelligence and community cooperation. When Fatima finished reading, Ibrahim applauded genuinely. "That was an excellent story. You're a very talented writer." The girl beamed at the praise, then added thoughtfully, "Miss Ouedraogo says stories are important because they help us imagine different futures." Ibrahim glanced at Aida, who was watching the interaction with a gentle smile that revealed her pride in her student's growth and confidence. "Miss Ouedraogo is very wise," he told Fatima. "Different futures are exactly what we need to imagine." "Are you a teacher too?" Fatima asked Ibrahim, with the direct curiosity that children bring to adult conversations. "In a way," Ibrahim replied carefully, "I work to help make our country a safer place for children like you." "That's important work," Fatima said seriously, then brightened. "Maybe someday I'll write stories about people who make countries safe." After Fatima had run off to share her story with other classmates, Aida and Ibrahim continued their tour. In another classroom, they encountered a group of older students engaged in what appeared to be a heated but respectful debate about natural resource management. "The French mining companies take our gold to France," one boy was arguing passionately. "We do all the work, but they get most of the money." "But without their equipment and expertise, we couldn't extract the gold at all," countered a girl across the room. "Maybe the problem isn't foreign involvement, but making sure we get a fair share of the profits." "Why can't we develop our own expertise?" asked another student. "Other countries learn to manage their resources independently." Ibrahim found himself fascinated by the sophistication of their discussion. These children, many of whom had experienced displacement and family loss, were grappling with complex economic and political questions that occupied much of his attention as president. The teacher facilitating the discussion noticed their observers and approached quietly. "They're preparing for a school-wide debate competition," she explained. "The topic is Burkina Faso's path to economic independence. They've been researching and discussing these issues for weeks." "What conclusions are they reaching?" Ibrahim asked, genuinely curious about their perspectives. "Diverse ones," the teacher replied with a smile, "but most seem to believe that education and local capacity building are more important than choosing sides between foreign partners. They want to be strong enough to negotiate as equals rather than dependent on anyone's charity or exploitation." Ibrahim nodded thoughtfully. These children, many of whom had lost so much, were developing exactly the kind of critical thinking and national consciousness that would be essential for Burkina Faso's long-term development. Their conclusions, reached through their own investigation and debate, aligned remarkably with his own governing philosophy. Later that morning, as Ibrahim observed Aida teaching a lesson about Burkina Faso's natural resources, he found himself seeing his country's challenges through new eyes. The children asked thoughtful questions about gold mining, agricultural development, and the relationship between natural wealth and national prosperity. Questions that revealed both their intelligence and their awareness of the complexities facing their country. "Who can tell me why gold is important for Burkina Faso's economy?" Aida asked her students. Several hands shot up immediately. She called on a boy in the front row who answered confidently, "It's our biggest export. It brings money into our country." "That's right, Ismail," Aida confirmed. "And who benefits from this gold?" The question led to a thoughtful discussion about resource distribution, foreign mining companies, and recent government efforts to ensure the Burkinabe people received a greater share of profits from their natural resources. Throughout the discussion, Aida maintained a balanced approach, neither criticizing nor praising current policies, but encouraging the students to think critically about their country's future. Ibrahim listened with growing admiration. Aida was giving these children, many of whom had lost so much, the tools to understand their world and their place in it. She was teaching them to be informed, engaged citizens who would someday hold leaders like him accountable for their decisions. When the lesson ended and the students were engaged in a writing exercise, Aida moved to the back of the classroom where Ibrahim sat. "What did you think?" she asked quietly. "I think these children are fortunate to have you as your teacher," he replied sincerely. "You're giving them something no one can take away, knowledge and the ability to think critically about their world." During their conversation, Ibrahim noticed one particular student, a boy named Musa, who seemed to watch them intently while pretending to focus on his writing assignment. "That's Musa," Aida explained, following his gaze. "He lost both parents in an attack near the Mali border last year. His grandmother brought him to Ouagadougou for safety." Ibrahim felt the familiar surge of anger and determination that fueled his commitment to defeating the insurgent groups. But seeing Musa, resilient despite his losses, engaged in learning despite his trauma, also reminded him that military action alone was not sufficient. These children needed security, but they also needed education, opportunity, and hope for a future beyond the current crisis. "Does he know who I am?" Ibrahim asked quietly. Aida shook her head. "I don't think so. To him, you're just Miss Wedrego's friend who's interested in their education." There was something liberating about that anonymity. Being seen as a person rather than a position, being judged on his interactions with the children rather than his policies or public statements. Presidential Palace that evening. The crisis began with an encrypted message delivered to Ibrahim's secure phone as he was preparing to leave the palace for a quiet dinner with Aida. The simple vibration of the device immediately commanded his attention. Emergency communications were configured with specific alert patterns that distinguished genuine crises from routine updates. Multiple coordinated attacks had occurred along the northern border with Mali, with early reports indicating significant civilian casualties and the possibility that dozens of people had been taken captive by retreating insurgent forces. Within minutes, Ibrahim had canceled his personal plans and convened an emergency session with his military advisors and intelligence officials. The Situation Room filled rapidly with maps, satellite imagery, and reports from field commanders trying to assess the scope of the attacks and coordinate response efforts. The large central table became covered with documents marked urgent and classified, while wall-mounted screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds from various sources. "What do we know?" Ibrahim asked without preamble as he entered the room, his demeanor shifting seamlessly from the man who had spent a day observing children's education to the military commander responsible for national security. 7 villages attacked simultaneously between 0400 and 0600 hours, reported General Sawadogo, his chief military advisor, pointing to marked locations on a large tactical map. Well-coordinated operations suggesting significant planning and resources. Current confirmed casualties are 43 dead, with reports of dozens more wounded. Preliminary intelligence indicates at least 30 civilians were taken across the border during the retreat. Ibrahim studied the tactical displays, noting the strategic positioning of the attacked villages and the apparent coordination required for such simultaneous strikes. These were communities much like the one where Aida had been teaching when she was captured, remote, vulnerable, and often forgotten by previous governments until tragedy struck. "Pattern analysis?" he asked, looking for strategic insights that might inform both immediate response and longer-term security planning. "The target selection appears deliberate," responded Colonel Naburema, his intelligence chief, highlighting the affected areas on a digital map. "These villages are located near key smuggling routes and have been resistant to insurgent recruitment efforts. The attacks may serve both tactical and psychological purposes, eliminating sources of intelligence while demonstrating insurgent capability to communities that have cooperated with government forces." Ibrahim felt the familiar surge of anger that accompanied reports of civilian targeting, but he forced himself to maintain analytical focus. Emotional responses, however justified, had to be channeled into effective strategic thinking. "Military response capabilities?" he asked. "Forces from the regional command have been deployed, but they're encountering heavier resistance than anticipated," General Sawadogo continued, pointing to deployment positions on the tactical display. "The insurgents appear to be better armed than in previous engagements, possibly with weapons obtained through networks extending across the Sahel region. Equipment signatures suggest anti-vehicle mines and possibly shoulder-fired missiles." This escalation in insurgent capabilities represented a concerning development. Ibrahim's military strategy had been based on technological and training superiority over lightly armed groups. If the insurgents were acquiring advanced weapon systems, the strategic calculation would need significant revision. "Reinforcements are en route, but the terrain makes rapid deployment challenging," the general continued. "We're coordinating with air assets for reconnaissance and potential close support, but weather conditions are limiting visibility." Ibrahim absorbed this information while considering both immediate tactical needs and longer-term strategic implications. Each decision would affect not only the current crisis, but also the ongoing struggle to establish security and stability throughout Burkina Faso's northern regions. "What about the civilians who were taken?" he asked, the question carrying personal weight, given his recent conversations with Aida about her own experience as a captive. "We're coordinating with intelligence assets across the border," Colonel Naburema responded, pulling up tracking data on one of the wall screens. "Early signals intelligence suggest the groups have separated the captives, moving them to different locations to complicate rescue operations. We're working with regional partners to identify their probable destinations, but cross-border coordination remains challenging given political tensions with the current Malian leadership." I understood the diplomatic complexities that complicated military responses. Burkina Faso's withdrawal from ECOWAS and formation of the Alliance of Sahel States had created new regional dynamics that affected intelligence sharing and military cooperation. "Time factors for rescue operations?" he asked. "Critical window is approximately 72 hours. After that, captives are typically moved to more permanent locations or across additional borders, making recovery exponentially more difficult." For the next 6 hours, Ibrahim remained in the Situation Room coordinating rescue efforts, directing military resources, and making the difficult decisions required of a wartime leader. He authorized the deployment of special forces units, approved intelligence sharing protocols with neighboring countries, and personally spoke with regional commanders to emphasize the priority of civilian rescue operations. The reports that came in throughout the night painted an increasingly grim picture. The insurgents had demonstrated new levels of organization and equipment. Several military vehicles had been destroyed by improvised explosive devices, and 2 soldiers had been killed while attempting to pursue retreating insurgent forces. Most disturbingly, intercepted communications suggested that the attacks were part of a broader campaign designed to demonstrate insurgent capability and discourage civilian cooperation with government forces. The psychological warfare dimension was becoming as important as the tactical one. When preliminary reports finally indicated that the immediate crisis had been contained, the human cost was devastating. 62 confirmed dead, more than 100 wounded, and 31 civilians confirmed taken across the border. The military had succeeded in preventing further attacks and had secured the affected area, but the broader mission of protecting civilians had clearly failed. As he finally returned to his private quarters in the early morning hours, Ibrahim felt the familiar weight of responsibility that accompanied such tragedies. Each casualty represented a family destroyed, a community traumatized, a failure of his government's primary responsibility to protect its citizens. His phone buzzed with a text message from Aida. "I saw the news reports. I know you are carrying this weight alone tonight. Remember that you cannot save everyone, but your efforts to protect as many as possible matter more than you may realize." The message brought unexpected comfort. Most people in his orbit either offered empty platitudes about the necessities of leadership or made demands for specific actions. Aida instead offered understanding without judgment, acknowledgement without false reassurance. The following day, as Ibrahim prepared to address the nation about the attacks, he received an unexpected visitor. Aida had come to the palace carrying a large envelope, having convinced his security staff that she had something important to deliver on behalf of her students. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, as she was escorted into a small anteroom adjacent to the studio where his televised address would be recorded. "But when my students heard about the attacks, they insisted on doing something to help." She handed him the envelope. "They wrote letters and drew pictures for the children affected by the violence. They wanted their president to ensure these reached the families who are suffering." Ibrahim accepted the envelope, deeply moved by the gesture. The children who had experienced their own trauma were reaching out to help others facing similar pain, a demonstration of empathy and solidarity that transcended the political and military dimensions of the crisis. "Of course I'll make sure these are delivered," he assured her. "There's one more thing," Aida added, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "Musa wrote something specifically for you. He asked me to make sure you read it personally." Ibrahim unfolded the paper to find careful handwriting in French. "Dear Mr. President, my teacher says you are working to stop the bad people who hurt families like mine. I am sad about the new children who lost their parents yesterday. Please tell them that even though it hurts very much now, they can still have good days again someday. I have good days now when I learn new things with Miss Ouedraogo. Thank you for trying to protect everyone. From Musa." The letter affected Ibrahim profoundly, offering both simple wisdom and unexpected comfort from a child who had experienced such devastating loss. Here was a reminder of what all his security operations were ultimately designed to protect, not just territory or strategic interests, but the possibility of healing, learning, and hope. "Thank you for bringing this," he told Aida, his voice slightly rough with emotion. "It helps me remember why we do what we do." When Ibrahim delivered his televised address about the attacks, he spoke with his usual combination of resolve and reassurance, outlining security measures and promising accountability for those responsible. But then, departing from his prepared script, he shared Musa's message with the nation. "Today I received a letter from a young boy who lost his own parents to similar violence. He wanted me to tell the children affected by yesterday's attacks that although it hurts terribly now, good days will come again." His words remind us that our greatest strength lies not just in our military response, but in our capacity to care for one another, to educate our children, and to build a future worthy of their resilience and hope. 3 weeks later, Ibrahim's relationship with Aida had continued to develop through regular meetings, sometimes at discreet locations arranged by his staff, sometimes at her modest apartment where she cooked traditional meals and they could talk without the formality that surrounded his official duties. Their connection was deepening beyond their initial reunion, growing into something that acknowledged both their shared past and their current realities. The decision to invite Aida to the upcoming state dinner for visiting leaders from the Alliance of Sahel states represented a significant step. Ibrahim knew that her presence at such a high-profile diplomatic event would effectively make their relationship official in the eyes of Burkina Faso's political establishment, and soon enough, the general public. "A state dinner?" Aida questioned when he extended the invitation. "That seems very official." "It is," Ibrahim acknowledged. "But I'd like you to be there, not hidden away or given some artificial role to justify your presence, but simply as someone important to me." "You realize what message that will send?" It wasn't a question. "I do," he confirmed, "and I'm comfortable with that message if you are, but I understand if you'd prefer not to step into such a public role." Aida considered the implications carefully. Accepting would change how she was perceived in her community and at her school. It would subject her to scrutiny she had never sought and could complicate her ability to do her work without political interference. But declining would establish a pattern of secrecy that contradicted the authenticity they both valued in their relationship. "I'll come," she decided, "but you need to understand that I won't be a political asset or a liability. I can't just be an extension of your public role." "I would never ask that of you," Ibrahim assured her. "Your independence, your distinct perspective, those are essential to who you are and what you mean to me." The state dinner proceeded with the usual diplomatic choreography, but Ibrahim's introduction of Aida as his personal guest, rather than in some official capacity, sent ripples through the assembled dignitaries. Her presence represented something unprecedented in the formal world of West African diplomacy, a leader's public acknowledgement of a personal relationship without political calculation. Throughout the evening, Aida navigated the unfamiliar territory of high-level diplomatic protocol with natural dignity. She engaged thoughtfully in conversations about regional security, educational initiatives, and cultural exchange, offering perspectives that reflected her lived experience with the insurgency and her current work with traumatized children. Ibrahim, observing her interactions from across the room as he fulfilled his duties as host, felt a surge of admiration. She belonged in this setting not because of any official position, but because of the substance she brought to every conversation, the authentic voice of someone who had experienced the consequences of policy decisions and was now working to heal their effects. Late in the evening, after the formal dinner had concluded and guests had moved to a reception area, Ibrahim found a moment to speak privately with Aida. "You've impressed everyone tonight," he said quietly, "especially the education minister from Niger, who seems quite interested in your trauma-informed teaching approaches." "And I'm happy to share whatever might help children in similar situations," Aida replied. "That kind of knowledge shouldn't be limited by national borders." "No, it shouldn't," Ibrahim agreed, thinking of the broader regional challenges that transcended individual countries: insurgency, climate change, economic development, and the need for educational systems capable of preparing young people for an uncertain future. Their moment of private conversation was interrupted by Ibrahim's aide, approaching with appropriate deference. "Mr. President, the Niger delegation is preparing to depart. Protocol suggests you should escort them out." "Of course," Ibrahim nodded. To Aida, he added, "I need to attend to this, but please stay until the event concludes." "I'll be here," she agreed. As Ibrahim fulfilled his remaining ceremonial responsibilities, he remained acutely aware of Aida's presence in the room, a personal connection that felt increasingly significant amid the diplomatic maneuvering that characterized such events. 4 months later. The relationship between Ibrahim and Aida had evolved into a partnership that encompassed both personal intimacy and serious discussions about Burkina Faso's future. Their conversations increasingly touched on the central question that defined Ibrahim's presidency: the promised transition to civilian rule that had been repeatedly delayed due to security concerns. They were walking through Bangor Wiogo Urban Park one evening, Ibrahim's security detail maintaining a discreet distance, when Aida raised the subject directly. The international community is increasing pressure for concrete steps toward elections, she observed, and domestic voices are beginning to question whether the delays are truly about security or about maintaining power. Ibrahim didn't respond immediately. The official position of his government was clear. Elections would be held when security conditions permitted proper democratic processes throughout the country. But Aida's question touched on doubts that had been growing in his own mind. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, genuinely seeking her perspective. "I think you already know," she replied gently. "The Ibrahim I knew as a student believed deeply in people's right to determine their own future." "I still believe that," he insisted, "but I've also seen how that right can be manipulated by foreign interests, by extremist groups, by politicians who promise everything and deliver nothing." "So you don't trust the Burkina people to make the right choice?" she asked, the question striking at something fundamental. Ibrahim paused, considering his response carefully. He said finally, "I trust them, but I fear the circumstances might not allow for truly free choice, not yet." Their conversation was interrupted by urgent communication from his security chief. Intelligence reports indicated a possible coup attempt by hardline military elements opposed to any transition to civilian rule. The following hours tested everything Ibrahim had built as he worked to neutralize the threat while maintaining the stability necessary for democratic processes to eventually proceed. The attempted coup, while unsuccessful, clarified Ibrahim's thinking about his own role and the country's future. In its aftermath, he made a decision that surprised both his supporters and his critics. He announced a definitive timeline for elections within 8 months, with a constitutional convention to begin immediately. "Some will call this a retreat," he told his National Security Council. "I see it as the fulfillment of our original purpose. We took power to correct a failing system, not to replace it permanently with military rule." The months that followed were intense with activity, as constitutional drafting committees worked to create a framework for civilian governance while maintaining the security improvements achieved during Ibrahim's presidency. Throughout this period, his relationship with Aida provided both personal support and valuable perspective on the concerns of ordinary citizens. "Have you considered your own role after the transition?" Aida asked one evening as they reviewed draft constitutional articles. "I've thought about several possibilities," Ibrahim replied. "Some expect me to find a way to maintain control, perhaps as a powerful defense minister, or through a constitutional provision for military oversight." "And what do you want?" she pressed. Ibrahim was quiet for a long moment. "I want Burkina Faso to be secure and prosperous," he said finally. "But I'm not convinced that requires me to remain in power indefinitely. Perhaps the best service I can provide is to demonstrate that military intervention can be truly temporary, that power can be transferred voluntarily when its purpose has been achieved." The constitutional referendum, held 6 months later, passed with 67% support from Burkina voters. The document established strong civilian institutions while preserving military autonomy in security matters, a compromise that reflected the complex realities of governing in an unstable region. Inauguration Day. Ibrahim stood on the presidential palace balcony on his final morning as head of state, watching Ouagadougou awaken under a clear Sahelian sky. In a few hours, he would transfer power to Burkina Faso's newly elected civilian president, completing the transition process he had initiated 18 months earlier. The journey had not been smooth. Electoral preparations had faced multiple challenges from insurgent groups attempting to disrupt the process, from international observers questioning the military's commitment to neutrality, and from domestic critics who doubted whether genuine democratic competition was possible given the military's continued influence. But Ibrahim had kept his promise to remain neutral during the campaign, neither endorsing candidates nor allowing military interference in the electoral process. The result was an election that, while imperfect, represented a genuine choice by the Burkinabe people about their future leadership. Aida arrived at the palace that morning to accompany him to the inauguration ceremony, their first completely public appearance as a couple, representing not just their personal relationship but Ibrahim's confidence in the transition he was completing. "You look presidential," she observed with a smile as he adjusted his formal uniform one final time. "One last time," he replied, "and after today? After today, you begin being just Ibrahim again," she said, "with new challenges and new possibilities." At the ceremonial grounds, crowds gathered to witness this historic transfer of power. International dignitaries, regional leaders, and Burkinabe citizens from all walks of life watched as Ibrahim delivered his final address as president. Leadership is not measured by how power is acquired, but by how willingly it is relinquished when its purpose has been fulfilled. Today, we demonstrate that military intervention in civilian governance can indeed be exceptional and temporary. With dignified ceremony, Ibrahim transferred the instruments of office to his elected successor. As the new president delivered his inaugural address, Ibrahim felt an unexpected lightness, the burden of ultimate responsibility lifting from his shoulders for the first time in years. Bobo Dioulasso, 6 months later. The house Ibrahim had arranged in Burkina Faso's second city was modest but comfortable, with a garden where Aida could grow vegetables and a study where Ibrahim could write about his experiences in leadership. The morning sun streamed through windows that faced east toward Ouagadougou, a symbolic connection to the capital they had left behind while embracing their new life together. They had married quietly 3 months after the inauguration, a simple ceremony attended by family and close friends rather than the state occasion that protocol officers had originally suggested. The ceremony had taken place in Aida's home village, now rebuilt and secure, with many of her former students attending alongside Ibrahim's family members and a few trusted colleagues from his presidency. Ibrahim's transition to civilian life had presented unexpected challenges that went beyond the obvious adjustment of no longer wielding executive power. For years, his days had been structured by security briefings, cabinet meetings, and crisis responses that demanded immediate attention. Now, for the first time since his university days, he was responsible for creating his own schedule and defining his own priorities. "Do you miss it?" Aida asked one morning as they worked together in their garden, tending to tomato plants that reminded Ibrahim of the school garden where he had first understood the healing power of nurturing growth. She was kneeling beside a row of okra plants, her hands covered in the rich red soil that had once been the subject of his geological studies. "Sometimes," he admitted honestly, pausing in his work with a small-hand cultivator, "I miss the ability to make decisions that could immediately improve people's lives. When I ordered the construction of new schools or directed resources to healthcare clinics, I could see tangible results within months. Now, my influence is more indirect, more gradual." "But also more sustainable?" Aida suggested, looking up at him with soil-stained hands, shading her eyes from the morning sun. Ibrahim considered her observation while watching a small bird land near their garden, pecking at insects disturbed by their gardening work. Perhaps, he agreed. The decisions I made as president had immediate impact, but they also created dependencies. Every policy required constant maintenance. Every initiative needed ongoing presidential attention to survive. What we're doing now, teaching, writing, supporting community development, those activities build capacity that can continue without us. And personally? She asked, the question carrying deeper implications about their relationship and his adjustment to private life. Personally, I'm learning to be influential without being in control, to contribute without commanding. It's a different kind of leadership, perhaps a more mature one. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small delegation from the nearby village primary school. 3 children, accompanied by their teacher, approached the garden gate with the careful politeness that rural Burkinabe children showed when visiting adults they respected but didn't know intimately. "Excuse me, Mr. Traoré," the teacher called out in French, then switched to Dioula for the children's benefit. "The children have prepared something they would like to share with you and your wife." Aida and Ibrahim set aside their gardening tools and approached the gate, both curious about this unexpected visit. The teacher, a young woman perhaps in her mid-20s, appeared nervous but determined. "We heard that you live here now," she explained. "The children wanted to thank you for the school improvements that were made during your presidency. Our classroom has new desks and books now, and we received the solar panels that provide electricity for the first time." The oldest of the 3 children, a boy of perhaps 12, stepped forward with a carefully wrapped package. "We made this for you," he said in clear French, obviously having practiced the presentation. "It's to show that we remember." Ibrahim accepted the package and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a hand-carved wooden plaque. The carving showed a tree with deep roots and spreading branches, with small figures of children sitting in its shade. Below the image, carved in both French and Arabic script, were the words, "A leader plants trees whose shade he may not ever enjoy." The gift affected Ibrahim deeply, both for its craftsmanship and for its message. Here was a reminder that leadership's true measure might not be found in immediate results, but in foundations laid for future generations. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "Thank you for creating it and for bringing it to us." "Our teacher told us that saying," the boy explained proudly. "It means that good leaders think about the future, not just about being famous." Aida stepped forward, smiling at the children with the warmth that had made her such an effective teacher. "Would you like to see our garden?" she asked. "We're growing some of the same vegetables you probably have at home." For the next hour, Ibrahim and Aida showed the children around their small compound, explaining their gardening techniques and listening to the children's own stories about their families and their school experiences. The informal conversation revealed bright, curious minds, eager to learn and contribute to their community's development. As the delegation prepared to leave, the teacher approached Ibrahim privately. "Mr. Traoré," she said quietly, "I wanted to tell you that many of us in the education sector appreciated what you accomplished, not just the infrastructure improvements, but the emphasis on local capacity building and the respect you showed for teachers' work." "Thank you," Ibrahim replied, "but the real credit belongs to teachers like you who do the daily work of developing our country's most important resource, educated, thoughtful citizens." After the visitors had departed, Ibrahim and Aida returned to their garden work, but the conversation had shifted their mood toward reflection about the broader impact of Ibrahim's presidential role and their current role in Burkina Faso's continued development. "That was unexpected," Aida observed, carefully transplanting seedlings they had started in small pots, "but meaningful. It reminded me that influence doesn't require official position," Ibrahim said, helping her water the newly planted seedlings. Sometimes the most important impact comes through personal example and individual relationships. As the afternoon progressed, they were joined by other visitors, a former colleague from Ibrahim's university days, who was now involved in sustainable mining initiatives, a regional development coordinator seeking advice on community engagement strategies, and a journalist working on a book about West African political transitions, who wanted to interview Ibrahim about his decision to transfer power voluntarily. Each conversation reinforced Ibrahim's growing understanding of his post-presidential role. Rather than being excluded from national affairs, he was finding new ways to contribute that didn't require the formal authority he had once wielded. His opinions carried weight because of his experience, but they generated influence through persuasion rather than command. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in their small kitchen, Aida reflected on the day's events. "You're creating a new model," she observed, chopping vegetables for the stew they were preparing. "Most former leaders in our region either disappear from public life entirely or spend their time trying to regain power. You're finding a third path." "I hope so," Ibrahim replied, stirring onions that were sautéing in palm oil. "The transition succeeded partially because people believed it was genuine, that I wasn't planning to manipulate things from behind the scenes. But that doesn't mean I have to be completely absent from national conversations. Especially when your perspective could help other countries facing similar challenges," Aida added, thinking of the journalist's questions about documenting his experiences for other African leaders. As they sat down to eat their simple meal, the sounds of evening life in Bobo Dioulasso drifted through their open windows. Children playing in nearby compounds, radios broadcasting the day's news, and the calls of street vendors selling their final wares. It was a soundtrack of normal life, of people pursuing their daily activities without crisis or emergency, the kind of stability that Ibrahim's presidency had worked to establish and that their current life represented. "There's something I've been thinking about," Aida said, as they finished their dinner. "Oh?" Ibrahim asked, intrigued by her tone. "The Regional Education Network has asked me to develop a program for training teachers who work with children affected by conflict," she explained. "It would involve travel to other countries, establishing partnerships with universities, creating curriculum materials. Significant work, but work that could have impact across West Africa." Ibrahim smiled, recognizing the opportunity this represented both for Aida personally and for their shared commitment to regional development. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work you should be doing," he said. "What would you need from me?" "Your support, obviously, but also possibly your participation. Your experience with post-conflict governance could be valuable for training programs aimed at education leaders in affected areas." The conversation continued late into the evening as they discussed practical details and broader implications of Aida's proposal. By the time they prepared for bed, they had outlined a potential partnership that would combine their different areas of expertise in service of regional peace and development. Standing on their small balcony overlooking the quiet streets of Bobo Dioulasso, Ibrahim reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. From geology student to military officer to president to private citizen engaged in education and development work, each phase had seemed impossible to predict from the previous one. "Any regrets?" Aida asked, joining him at the balcony railing. Ibrahim considered the question seriously, thinking about the paths not taken, the costs of public service, the personal sacrifices that leadership had required. "Some," he admitted. "I regret that it took a crisis to bring us back together. I regret the people who died because my government couldn't protect them. I regret the opportunities missed because of political calculations." "But not the larger choices?" she pressed. "No," he said finally, not joining the military when civilian institutions were failing, not taking action when previous leadership proved inadequate, not prioritizing the transition to civilian rule when it became clear that extended military government would create its own problems. Those were difficult decisions, but they were the right ones. As they prepared to go inside, the sound of distant thunder reminded them that the rainy season was approaching, the time when Burkina Faso's landscape would transform from dusty brown to vibrant green, when farmers would plant the crops that would feed the nation through another year. New growth, Aida observed, listening to the approaching storm. New possibilities, Ibrahim agreed, taking her hand as they stepped back into their home. The future stretched ahead of them with uncertainties but also with promise. Ibrahim Traoré, no longer president but forever shaped by that experience, looked toward tomorrow with something he had rarely permitted himself during his years in office: hope untempered by the weight of ultimate responsibility. Beside him, Aida Ouedraogo, survivor and teacher, represented not just personal happiness, but a connection to the man he had been before power and the man he was becoming after it. Together they would face whatever challenges emerged, armed with experience, wisdom, and the rare gift of love that had survived separation, trauma, and the complexities of public life. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall on the red earth of Burkina Faso, promising renewal and growth in the months to come.